Well, let me first thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I have good news. I'm going to be brief. And I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. I strongly believe that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So I'm just going to make a few points with respect to the sufficiency economy and the philosophy that the king has advanced and that I tried to learn about, because to be very frank, when Nui very kindly and colleagues invited me to participate in this event, my first reaction was, what is sufficiency economy? I'm a Brazilian economist, nobody's perfect, and I didn't quite understand in the beginning what were we talking about. My first reaction was, are we talking about corporate social responsibility? Are we talking about corporate governance? And the good news is that by now you fully understand that we are talking much more than that. Of course, there are elements of corporate social responsibility, there are elements of corporate governance, but something that goes well beyond this. So let me try to summarize what I was able to distill from the readings that I made very quickly. And I have to be frank with you, most of them on the airplane coming yesterday from Brazil to here. So I will make just 7 points. Okay, I'm a big fan of George Miller, a psychologist in Princeton, that in 1956 wrote a famous paper which is called 7 plus or less 2, the magic number. And his basic point is that in our short-term memory, typically we are able to maintain 7 pieces of information. Plus or less 2. People like Bala, that is going to talk after me, can keep up to 9. People like me, only 5, but I have written 7. So let me go quickly what would be, and this relies on the literature, basically written mainly by Thai economists, and there is actually a rich literature on the sufficiency economy that I learned based on some of the suggestions that Nui and others had presented to me. So, in a nutshell, there are the following elements. The first, an emphasis on appropriate technology. We could even go to the direction of focus on frugal innovation. But I don't think that it's only that, but it's to have appropriate technology. And this goes back, for instance, to Schumacher, goes back to the small and beautiful literature, but it's not only limited to appropriate technology. Because in the end, when we talk about innovation, there are different ways to approach the issue of innovation. There is innovation at the level of a country, a developing country like Thailand, which is basically the replication of things that already exist in the world, but then you try to adapt to your local characteristics. This is what I would call the one-to-N expansion of any kind of innovation and introduction of new technologies. Now, there is the innovation that is much more challenging, which people like Peter Thiel calls the 0 to 1, meaning things that are completely new to the world. So, in the philosophy of sufficiency economy, we are not necessarily going simply for adaptation of things that already exist. We may also be talking about innovation that is totally new to the world, but is proper to the local context, and this is very important. So this is number 1. Number 2 is something that will resonate with all of us in the Western world today, which is the focus on the long term. And the criticism embedded in this proposition of too much focus on profit in the short term. And this, of course, is very important if we think For instance, in the incentives in the financial sector, in the incentives in corporations nowadays, where every CEO is trying to perform accordingly to quarterly reports and often missing the real objectives of a corporation. So this is the second point, the focus on a long-term approach. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is easy, particularly in a world where competitiveness is key. But it's an approach that, if properly communicated, may change minds on how you should, let's say, quote-unquote, compete. It's a competition in a different term. The third point is consistency with management capacity. So the idea that you have to be very clear about what you can absorb and what you can manage in the context of your organizational structure, be it at the level of the firm, be it at the level of the community, be it at the level of the country. So do not chew more than you can really eat, and have clarity of what is your management capacity. Another point, and I'm going quickly to the 7, but another point is the question of honesty, but honesty understood as honesty towards all stakeholders. And it pushes the envelope to a certain extent to consider also honesty towards future generations. So you have to be able not only to be able to account for your actions in terms of your own generation, but in terms of your implications for the environment, for instance, and the future. What else? Well, you can also derive from the propositions in the philosophy an emphasis, it may come as a surprise to you, on the idea of risk diversification, exactly to increase resilience of your activities. And in this context, you should put lots of emphasis on risk diversification to avoid that an external shock is going somehow to totally bankrupt your initiative. Another important point, and the 6th point that I could derive from the writings associated with sufficiency economy, and once again is a very important point in our current context, is to avoid excessive leverage, meaning try to avoid too much indebtedness. Few people know, and since we were talking about philosophy and Buddha, but we can go also to Jesus Christ and when the language that he spoke, Aramaic. The word for debt and the word for sin is the same. Of course, nobody is suggesting that you should not get into debt, because debt offers the opportunity of leverage and offers the opportunity of a much faster growth by financing activities. On the other hand, too much indebtedness may create the kind of problems that we saw with the global financial crisis. So these are the 6 points that I saw in the writings, and the last one that I could add, just to make 7 since I started with the magic number, is the importance of employment creation in the context of these activities. So, I don't know if you kept count, I hope I came to 7, but just to finalize, as always, the devil is in the details, because you can easily imagine a situation in which the incentives in the economy are misaligned with quote-unquote good intentions. I always quote as an example of incentives misaligned the history of a situation, since we are going to hear from Bala in a moment, in New Delhi in the 19th century. The Brits were very concerned with the amount of snakes. So they created an incentive for each snake killed that was brought to the British government. They would pay a fee. And the Indians, very entrepreneurial, immediately put together snake farms and began to bring lots of snakes. So the Brits, of course, decided to cut the incentive. The Indians released the snakes. So, as you can imagine, if you don't have proper alignment of incentives, things can go wrong. Another example, when we talk about appropriate technology, is the question, what is the technology for? What is your objective? Again, since Bala is here, let me quote another example of India. Milton Friedman, visiting India, was taken to a project, a construction of a road. And the Indian professor that was with him was showing the construction with hundreds of people working with shovels and opening the road. And Milton Friedman, this is in the 1960s, asked, why are they not using tractors? And the Indian professor said, Professor Friedman, you don't understand. This is a job generation project. The objective is not the road, it's the job that it's creating. And then Milton Friedman retorted, then you should give them spoons rather than shovels. So appropriate technology has to be kept in mind when we are thinking about what is the ultimate objective. But the main message that I get from the literature on sufficiency economy is the importance of the moral compass. And here, since we talked about Buddhism, Dalai Lama has a very interesting proposition, which ethics is like water. Everybody needs it. Religion is more like tea. It adds some spice. But I don't want to refer to sex, love, and Buddhism simply because one very important aspect of all of this is to have a vision that you can implement. Because vision without implementation is hallucination. In the case of the projects that we just saw, we can, of course, relate very clear to concrete activities. The question is, can the world at large follow the same kind of incentives? And I would argue that the key question is, can we change our moral compass towards the kind of things that Nui just highlighted in terms of honesty, in terms of enoughness, whatever, I don't know if this word exists, but I just created it, but certainly a world that operates in different incentives. Thank you very much.